Section 1 of Woman and War by Olive Schreiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Noel Badrian. Section 1. Chapter 1. It may be said, granting fully that you are right, that, as woman's old fields of labor slip from her, she must grasp new, or must become wholly dependent on her sexual function alone, all the other elements of human nature in her becoming atrophied and arrested through lack of exercise. And, granting that her evolution being arrested, the evolution of the whole race will be also arrested in her person, granting all this to the full, and allowing that the bulk of human labor tends to become more and more intellectual and less purely mechanical, as perfected machinery takes the place of crude human exertion, and that therefore, if woman is to be saved from degeneration and parasitism, and the body of humanity from arrest, she must receive a training which will cultivate all the intellectual and all the physical faculties, and be allowed freely to employ them. Nevertheless, would it not be possible, and be well, that a dividing line of some kind should be drawn between the occupations of men and of women? Would it not be possible that woman should retain agriculture, textile manufactory, trade, domestic management, the education of youth, and medicine, in addition to childbearing, as her exclusive fields of toil, while to the male should be left the study of abstract science, law and war, and statecraft, as of old man took war and the chase, and woman absorbed the further labors of life? Why should there not be again a fair and even division in the field of social labor? Superficially, this suggestion appears rational, having at least this to recommend it, that it appears to harmonize with the course of human evolution in the past. But closely examined, it will, we think, be found to have no practical or scientific basis, and to be out of harmony with the conditions of modern life. In ancient and primitive societies, the mere larger size and muscular strength of man in certain mechanical directions, and woman's incessant physical activity in childbearing and suckling, made almost inevitable such a sexual division of labor in almost all countries, save perhaps in ancient Egypt. Footnote: the division of labor between the sexes in ancient Egypt and in other exceptional countries is a matter of much interest, which cannot here be entered on. End of footnote. Woman naturally took the heavy agricultural and domestic labors, which were yet more consistent with the continual dependence of infant life on her own, than those of man in war and the chase. There was nothing artificial in such a division. It threw the heaviest burden of the most wearying and unexciting forms of social labor on woman, but under it both sexes labored, and each transmitted to the other, through inheritance, the fruits of its slowly expanding and always exerted powers, and the race progressed. Individual women might sometimes, and even often, become the warriors or chiefs of tribes. The king of Ashanti might train his terrible regiment of females, and men might now and again plant and weave for their children. But in the main, and in most societies, the division of labor was just, natural, beneficial, and it was inevitable that such a division should take place. Were today a band of civilized men, women, and infants thrown down absolutely naked and defenseless in some desert, and cut off hopelessly from all external civilized life, undoubtedly very much the old division of labor would, at least for a time, reassert itself. Men would look about for stones and sticks with which to make weapons, with which to repel wild beasts and enemies, and would go a-hunting meat, and tend the beasts when tamed. Footnote: The young captured animals would probably be tamed and reared by the woman. End of footnote. Women would suckle their children, cook the meat men brought, build shelters, look for roots, and if possible cultivate them. There certainly would be no parasite in the society. The woman who refused to labor for her offspring, and the man who refused to hunt or defend society, would not be supported by their fellows, would soon be extinguished by want. As wild beasts were extinguished and others tamed, and the materials for war improved, fewer men would be needed for hunting and war. Then they would remain at home and aid in building and planting. Many women would retire into the house to perfect domestic toil and handicrafts, and on a small scale the common ancient evolution of society would practically repeat itself. But for the present we see no such natural and spontaneous division of labor based on natural sexual distinctions in the new fields of intellectual or delicately skilled manual labor which are taking the place of the old. Chapter 2. It is possible, though at present there is nothing to give indication of such a fact, and it seems highly improbable that, in some subtle manner, now incomprehensible, there might tend to be a subtle correlation between that condition of the brain and nervous system which accompanies ability in the direction of certain forms of mental, social labor, and the particular form of reproductive function possessed by an individual. It may be that, inexplicable as it seems, there may ultimately be found to be some connection between that condition of the brain and nervous system which fits the individual for the study of higher mathematics, let us say, and the nature of their sex attributes. The mere fact that, of the handful of women who, up to the present, have received training and been allowed to devote themselves to abstract study, several have excelled in the higher mathematics, proves of necessity no preeminent tendency on the part of the female sex in the direction of mathematics, as compared to labor in the fields of statesmanship, administration, or law, as into these fields there has been practically no admittance for women. It is sometimes stated that as several women of genius in modern times have sought to find expression for their creative powers in the art of fiction, there must be some inherent connection in the human brain between the ovarian sex function and the art of fiction. The fact is that modern fiction, being merely a description of human life in any of its phases, and being the only art that can be exercised without special training or special appliances, and produced in the moments stolen from the multifarious, brain-destroying occupations which fill the average woman's life, they have been driven to find this outlet for their powers as the only one presenting itself. How far otherwise might have been the directions in which their genius would naturally have expressed itself can be known only to the women themselves. What the world has lost by the compulsory expression of genius in a form which may not have been its most natural form of expression, or only one of its forms, no one can ever know. Even in the little third-rate novelist whose works cumber the ground, we see often a pathetic figure when we recognize that beneath that failure in a complex and difficult art may lie buried a sound legislator, an able architect, an original scientific investigator, or a good judge. Scientifically speaking, it is as unproven that there is any organic relation between the brain of a female and the production of art in the form of fiction as that there is an organic relation between the hand of woman and the typewriter. Both the creative writer and the typist, in their respective spheres, are merely finding outlets for their powers in the direction of least mental resistance. The tendency of women at the present day to undertake certain forms of labor proves only that in the crabbed, walled-in, and bound conditions surrounding woman at the present day, these are the lines along which action is most possible to her. It may possibly be that in future ages, when the male and female forms have been placed in like intellectual conditions, with like stimuli, like trainings, and like rewards, some aptitudes may be found running parallel with the line of sex function when humanity is viewed as a whole. It may possibly be that when the historian of the future looks back over the history of the intellectually freed and active sexes for many generations, a decided preference of the female intellect for mathematics, engineering, or statecraft may be made clear, and that a like-marked inclination in the male to excel in acting, music, or astronomy may, by careful and large comparison, be shown. But for the present we have no adequate scientific data from which to draw any conclusion, and any attempt to divide the occupations in which male and female intellects and wills should be employed must be to attempt a purely artificial and arbitrary division, a division not more rational and scientific than an attempt to determine by the color of his eyes and the shape and strength of his legs whether a lad should be an astronomer or an engraver. Chapter 3. Those physical differences among mankind which divide races and nations, not merely those differences, enormously greater as they are generally than any physical differences between male and female of the same race, which divide the Jew and the Swede, the Japanese and the Englishman, but even those subtle physical differences which divide closely allied races such as the English and the German, often appear to be allied with subtle differences in intellectual aptitudes. Yet even with regard to these differences, it is almost impossible to determine scientifically in how far they are the result of national traditions, environment, and education, and in how far they run parallel with the differences in physical conformation. Footnote: in thinking of physical sex differences, the civilized man of modern times has always to guard himself against being unconsciously misled by the very exaggerated external sex differences which our unnatural method of sex clothing and dressing the hair produces. The unclothed and natural human male and female bodies are not more divided from each other than those of the lion and lioness. Our remote Saxon ancestors, with their great white bodies and flowing hair worn long by both sexes, were but little distinguished from each other, while among their modern descendants the short-haired, darkly clothed, manifestly two-legged male differs absolutely from the usually long-haired, color-bedizened, much-skirted female. Were the structural differences between male and female really one half as marked as the artificial visual differences, they would be greater than those dividing not merely any species of man from each other, but as great as those which divide orders in the animal world. Only a mind exceedingly alert and analytical can fail ultimately to be misled by habitual visual misrepresentation. There is not, probably, one man or woman in 20,000 who is not powerfully influenced in modern life in their conception of the differences, physical and intellectual, dividing the human male and female by the grotesque exaggerations of modern attire and artificial manners. End of footnote. No study of the mere physical differences between individuals of different races would have enabled us to arrive at any knowledge of their mental aptitude, nor does the fact that certain individuals of a given human variety have certain aptitudes form a rational ground for compelling all individuals of that variety to undertake a certain form of labor. No analysis, however subtle, of the physical conformation of the Jew could have suggested a priori, and still less could have proved, apart from ages of practical experience, that, running parallel with any physical characteristics which may distinguish him from his fellows, was an innate and unique intellectual gift in the direction of religion. The fact that, during 3,000 years, from Moses to Isaiah, through Jesus and Paul, on to Spinoza, the Jewish race has produced men who have given half the world its religious face and impetus, proves that, somewhere and somehow, whether connected organically with that physical organization that marks the Jew, or as the result of his traditions and training, there does go this gift in the matter of religion. But, on the other hand, we find millions of Jews who are totally and markedly deficient in it, and to base any practical legislation for the individual even on this proven intellectual aptitude of the race as a whole would be manifestly as ridiculous as abortive. Yet more markedly with the German, no consideration of his physical peculiarities, though it proceeded to the subtlest analysis of nerve, bone, and muscle, could in the present stage of our knowledge have proved to us what generations of experience appear to have proved, that with that organization which constitutes the German goes a unique aptitude for music. There is always the possibility of mistaking the result of training and external circumstance for inherent tendency. But when we consider the passion for music which the German has shown, and when we consider that the greatest musicians the world has seen, from Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart to Wagner, have been of that race, it appears highly probable that such a correlation between the German organization and the intellectual gift of music does exist. Similar intellectual peculiarities seem to be connoted by the external differences which mark off other races from each other. Nevertheless, if persons of all of these nationalities gathered in one colony, any attempt to legislate for their restriction to certain forms of intellectual labor on the grounds of their apparently proved national aptitudes or disabilities would be regarded as insane. To insist that all Jews, and none but Jews, should lead and instruct in religious matters, that all Englishmen, and none but Englishmen, should engage in trade, that each German should make his living by music, and none but a German allowed to practice it, would drive to despair the unfortunate individual Englishman whose most marked deficiency might be in the direction of finance and bartering trade power. The Jew whose religious instincts might be entirely rudimentary, or the German who could not distinguish one note from another, and the society as a whole would be an irredeemable loser, in one of the heaviest of all forms of social loss, the loss of the full use of the highest capacities of all its members. Chapter 4. It may be that with sexes, as with races, the subtlest physical differences between them may have their mental correlatives. But no abstract consideration of the human body in relation to its function of sex can, in the present state of our knowledge, show us what intellectual capacities tend to vary with sexual structure, and nothing in the present or past condition of male or female gives us more than the very faintest possible indication of the relation of their intellectual aptitudes and their sexual functions. And even if it were proved by centuries of experiment that with the possession of the uterine function of sex tends to go exceptional intellectual capacity in the direction of mathematics rather than natural history, or an inclination for statecraft rather than for mechanical invention, were it proved that, generally speaking, and as a whole, out of 20,000 women devoting themselves to law and 20,000 to medicine, they tended to achieve relatively more in the field of law than of medicine, there would yet be no possible healthy or rational ground for restricting the activities of the individual female to that line in which the average female appeared rather more frequently to excel. Footnote: minds not keenly analytical are always apt to mistake mere correlation of appearance with causative sequence. We have heard it gravely asserted that between potatoes, pigs, mud cabins, and Irishmen there was an organic connection. But we who have lived in colonies know that within 2 generations the purebred descendants of the mud cabin becomes often the successful politician, wealthy financier, or great judge, and shows no more predilection for potatoes, pigs, and mud cabins than men of any other race. End of footnote. That even one individual in a society should be debarred from undertaking that form of social toil for which it is most fitted makes an unnecessary deficit in the general social assets. That one male Froebel should be prohibited or hampered in his labor as an educator of infancy on the ground that infantile instruction was the field of the female, that one female with gifts in the direction of state administration should be compelled to instruct an infant school, perhaps without any gift for so doing, is a running to waste of social life-blood. Free trade in labor and equality of training, intellectual or physical, is essential if the organic aptitudes of a sex or class are to be determined. And our demand today is that natural conditions, inexorably but beneficently, may determine the labors of each individual, and not artificial restrictions. End of section 1.